Hello and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is a preview feature, application insights enhancements for Logic Apps standard. Alright, so just in terms of what this video is going to cover, so we're going to discuss the application insights enhancements for Logic Apps standard, which is currently in preview. If you're seeing this video, you're likely part of our private preview program, so thank you for doing so. This is an opt-in feature, so we're not going to break any existing telemetry if you go ahead and introduce this. You can think of it as basically schemas, right? Today, when you enable application insights for Logic Apps standard, there's a prescribed schema. What we do as part of the onboarding process is give you settings that you can use to go ahead and configure V2 of that schema. And so we'll pump telemetry using that schema itself. Now, in terms of application insights, the table structure, nothing has changed there. But how we populate those tables, some of the custom nodes that we can go ahead and create, that's where the difference is going to be. So if you have some existing queries, and perhaps you're basically querying, say, track properties or something like that, those queries won't work likely, like it'll be in a different format itself. But since this is a preview feature, it's something that you can enable on an existing Logic app standard instance, or if you want to just create new, just so you can go ahead and try it out. So the purpose of this video is just going to go ahead and showcase some of those enhancements. I'm not going to tell you how you set it up. You should have received that through other means. If you're interested in this and somehow stumbled on this video, reach out to me and I will see what I can do. Also want to shout out to Nikhil. He's an engineer on the Logic Apps team. He's been working on this specific feature and did a lot of content review. So thanks, Nikhil, and great work. All right, so if we want to talk about the areas of improvement, these are kind of the four, I guess, like key areas where we've made some changes. Traces table, requests table, exceptions table, and dependencies table. And so we're going to jump through all of those areas as part of this deck. Now let's start with traces table. So number one, the biggest change is we're not publishing data to this table anymore. And for good reasons. I think in the past there was a lot of duplication of information across traces and requests. And in many cases, we had to push data to traces basically as almost like a dependency so that you had to pull from there, which wasn't great. And so what we've done is we've moved the client tracking and the track properties from the traces table over to the request table. We'll talk about more of that in a bit. And therefore, we've reduced our dependency on traces table. And so this is, I think, good news for customers. In general, traces is very verbose. You were getting more than what you needed, but you had to use it because that's where your client tracking ID and your track properties were. And that led to larger costs. And so by reducing our dependency on this and being more focused in the request table, you should be able to reduce the amount of telemetry that you do store. Now, let's talk a little bit about requests table. So I've already talked about that the client tracking ID and the track properties now show up in request table. I'll show you that in the demo. We've also got some proper success codes, which is great. I think before we were like always saying something was successful, even if it failed. I think you're going to find that we've reflect reality better and give you an accurate depiction of whether or not a row, which represents like an action execution, was successful or not. So I think that makes things simpler to figure out if something was successful or if it erred. We also include a resource node where you're going to get more information about the resource that emitted this specific event. So what that typically means is like a workflow ID, a run instance ID that you can now query and use to establish linkages. As you know, when you run a Logic app, you have a run instance. It's kind of like the key for the execution of that workflow. And so you're going to find this value is now very prominent across our tables, and you can depend on using that value to link resources. Another way we do support linking of resources is the parent ID, where you've got, say, an action or a trigger that's been called, and you want to be able to refer back to the ID of the parent record, where you're going to be able to do that. We'll also see this a little bit in the dependencies and exceptions side of things as well. And then lastly, but not least, on the request table, this is pretty cool. Retry tracking is pretty awesome. I think what we've done is introduced a new node that will give you kind of a summary if you've got specific actions that have gone through retries. So I'm going to now switch over to a demo, and we're going to go through a demo of the request table. Then I'll come back and we'll get into the dependencies table and the exceptions table. All right, so we're going to keep the scenarios pretty simple on purpose, just so people can easily get up to speed with this and then naturally do more exploration as needed. So what I've got here is I've got a request response workflow. I've got my HTTP trigger. If I click on settings, I've got a tracking ID. Basically, I'm going to extract an order ID out of the message body, and we're going to use that as our custom tracking ID. I'm going to have a tracked property off of the compose action. Here, I'm just going to go ahead and add a key of solution name and the name of my application, which happens to be my Logic app. Then we'll just have a very simple response, just emitting a 200. And so what I'll now do is I'll go ahead and execute this workflow. I'll pause the recording for a couple minutes, and we'll let the telemetry flow to application insights, and then we'll take a look at what was created inside of application insights. All right, so I'm in Postman. I'm just going to go ahead and send in a request. Here you can see that order ID that we're going to use for our custom tracking ID, and we've got a successful execution, response code 200. All right, so that execution has completed, and what we see here is 4 records. So the bottom record here really represents the workflow, the entire sort of execution of the workflow. And so here we've got a success column or field of true, and we've got a result code that is 200, meaning it was okay. So that's exactly what we'd expect. If we saw an error, we should expect to see a result code like say 400 or 502 or something like that, and then success should be failed itself. So that's kind of the main record. You'll see some additional information here about that execution itself. But let's jump into the trigger and actions, as it's a little bit more meaningful in my mind. So here we've got the record for our trigger. We can see its name is manual. That's kind of the internal name of an HTTP trigger, being that it's manual. We've got, once again, the success and result codes, which is interesting. We've got the duration of how long this trigger, in this case, took to execute. And then if we head over to custom dimensions, this is where we'll start to see some interesting things. And let's expand correlation first. What's really interesting here is that client tracking ID. We'll find it inside of the correlation node. And then we've got that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that was part of the inbound message payload that I had set, and we're able to easily retrieve that. Then we've also got this resource node that I've talked about before, the run ID. So this is that same ID that you would see in the run history experience inside of Logic Apps. We've got the trigger name manual. We've talked about that before. We've got the workflow ID. So this is the system ID for that specific workflow. And then we also have the workflow name itself. Now, the important thing here is the operation ID and the operation parent IDs. These are also important for us. Once again, this is our run ID, which would allow us to link this back to that execution. And then also the parent ID. So if we make a note of this, C4 and then ends in AF, and we come back here and expand this, it will see that linkage, right? So that was the parent ID that belonged to the trigger, maps to the ID of the workflow that called it. And so once again, there's lots of ways to go ahead and to understand and create linkages across these triggers and actions. Now let's go to the action, the compose action, and let's take a look at our custom dimensions. If we head down custom dimensions, once again, we'll see similar basically records that we saw previously. So with correlation, we're going to see the client tracking ID being provided there. That's going to flow through. The resource, same thing. All of that information is going to be consistent. And then we get into track properties, and we see our solution name and the name of the app. Obviously, this is kind of like a property bag. If we had more tracked properties on here, we would see those listed as well. And then once again, operation name, operation ID, operation parent ID, same concept that we talked about before. And so this is pretty cool in my mind because it creates all of those various linkages across those specific records. Now let's go do something a little bit more interesting, and that is the retry test, right? So inside of the action here, we don't have a retry node because we didn't have any retries. But let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, the structure of this workflow is very similar to what we just showed before. It is a different workflow. I've added retry to the end here. So we do our tracking and custom tracking ID once again. We're going to go ahead and have tracked properties. But then what we're going to have here is a HTTP call to another resource that's going to fail. This URI is bad. And so as a result, we're going to go ahead and use the default retry policy. Or actually, sorry, it's not the default. I've changed it. It's a fixed interval. We're going to retry 3 times once every 60 seconds. That doesn't really matter. Even if you had the default, that would be fine. So let's go ahead. Let's run this from Postman and then take a look at the logs to see what it shows. All right, let's go ahead and kick this off. Because we're going to go through 3 retries, this is going to take a few minutes to run, and then naturally the telemetry has to hit App Insights. So I'll pause the recording, and we'll see in a couple minutes. Okay, so that process has run, and here are the related records. Now, because we did retry 3 times and then ultimately fail, we can see the result code of 502, and then overall the success is false. But we'll pause and talk more about exceptions here in a little bit. Let's go ahead and check out our HTTP action. So this was the action that was going to be retrying. If we then go ahead and expand custom dimensions, we're now going to have a node called retry history. And so what we can see is that we've got 3 specific retries. You can see like the error code, the start time, the end time, and the error details itself. So this is all packed up in sort of one node where you've got sort of as many records as there were attempts. And once again, very consolidated, very easy to query, very easy to look at and try to understand like when did this retry and how long did it take. So all in all, I really like this specific feature that we added because I think it simplifies that and you don't have to go look at a bunch of individual records here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about exceptions. We saw a bit of a preview there when that previous example, but some of the key fields that we're going to want to look at here is like the problem ID, where we can get a sense of like the error type, the outer message, which is kind of like a brief, basically exception message. If you're familiar with .NET, that's a concept that will resonate with you. Then like details, which is going to be the most verbose level of exception details that we can go ahead and obtain. And then naturally, we've talked a little bit about these before already, but the operation ID and the parent ID that once again allow us to do some linkaging. So if we see that a specific action has failed and we want to then be able to link it back up to the, say, workflow that had called it, then we can easily go ahead and do so. So let's take a look at the exceptions table. Okay, so now I'm in the exceptions table here, and I'm not going to process another record. That one did fail, so I think we can just go ahead and use the retry example that I just showed. So let's expand this. Number 1, we'll see problem ID, unresolvable name. So that's kind of like, as I mentioned before, like your very simple error code. So if you wanted to like say group exceptions based upon that field, that might be a good way of doing it. Outer message, it's basically a little bit more details. So we can see here that the HTTP request failed because of host not found, or no such host is known. And so that gives us a little bit more description. And then details is where we'll get like the most verbose explanation and get a bit of a stack trace. Probably more than what you need, but it's there if you're really interested in some of those lower level details itself. Now let's go ahead and see what else we have here. Once again, custom dimensions, correlation, so we can go ahead and see that we've got a client tracking ID. In this particular case, we didn't have any track properties on HTTP, so we don't see those there. We see details about the resource that this belongs to, as we've talked about before. And then also we've got the operation ID, is the run instance. And then here we've got the parent ID itself. So let's go ahead and copy this one. Now, what we would expect to find here is that this linkage, because we're in the exceptions, should be to the action where this failed. In this case, it would be the HTTP action. So this should match up with the ID of the HTTP action. And sure enough, like if we take a look at it, here is our ID. And this is what was captured, right? So DE6 and then CDF. So that's kind of that linkage. So if you wanted to then go back and get more information about the action where that exception was sort of raised from, we can go ahead and establish those linkages. All right, next up, we're going to talk about dependencies table, which works a little bit like the exceptions table. And what this allows us to do is if we have one resource that calls another resource, we want to be able to link those two records together across these different tables. And so the example I'm going to show you here is we're going to have a parent logic app that's going to call a child logic app. And we want to be able to link those two different events together. And so some of the fields that we'll focus on here: item type, name, operation ID, parent ID. So these are some concepts that we've talked about before, so I don't expect any surprises. All right, so this workflow looks very much like the retry one. The difference is this HTTP call actually works. And so this HTTP call will call that child workflow, and then we'll be able to go ahead and see the linkage itself. Once again, we'll continue to have a client tracking ID set up here, or custom tracking ID. We'll also have track properties showing up here as well. So once again, over to Postman, let's go ahead and call this, and we can see we've got a status back. So we'll flip over to Application Insights, give this a couple minutes, and then take a look at the telemetry. Okay, before we jump into the dependencies table, I just wanted to show you one thing in the requests table. So this represents, all of these records represent the execution of both of our workflows. So we can see here it starts with our parent. We've got then our trigger, we've got a compose, we've got an HTTP call. Then what we end up doing is we end up calling that child workflow. So here this record represents the child workflow, the trigger, the compose, the response from the child workflow, and then here is the response from the parent workflow itself. And so you can see all of those records that show up as a result. Now, if we hit up dependencies and we run this, actually let's do this. We'll just take the last one. This represents that dependency call that was made, right? And so here we can see that there was a post made to this child workflow itself. We've got the type, which is basically like the action name, in this case HTTP. We've got an item type of dependency. This is interesting. I'll show you why here shortly. We've got the custom dimensions, as you would expect, all of those details. We should also see the parent ID. Now in this case, the parent ID should represent the action that called it, so meaning HTTP. And so this ends in EF and then 5A. If we go to HTTP, we've got EF and then 5A, so that makes sense. Now, likely what you might want to do is do a union on these two tables based upon a value. Now, in this case, what we can do is use that run ID. So if we come over to dependencies and find out the run ID, we should be able to go ahead and copy this and then paste it into here and find our records here. And this is where that item type is important, because we can see that we've got a dependency record, and then we've got a linkage to these other basic actions that were part of that specific execution. And so this is where Custo comes in handy here, where we can start to do joins across these identifiers, which we have placed so that you can easily create these linkages itself. All right, so that concludes a walkthrough of this new preview feature, the application insight enhancements. Hopefully you found this useful and you're excited about what we're including in this specific release. If you have any feedback, just let me know. I'd be interested in hearing about it. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.